The crucifixion of Jesus, as described in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, stands as the greatest act of love and sacrifice ever recorded. From the betrayal in Gethsemane, where his sweat became like drops of blood, to the agonizing path to Calvary, each moment unveils unimaginable physical and emotional suffering. The weight of humanity's sins bore down with every step and every blow. Now, you will witness the detailed account of the sacrifice that forever changed the course of human history. This event takes place on the night before Jesus' crucifixion, after the Last Supper and the singing of a hymn, though the Bible does not specify which hymn it was. Jesus goes to the Garden of Gethsemane, which means place of the olive press, where olives were crushed to extract oil. He goes there to seek strength for the ordeal ahead. Jesus withdraws to pray alone, taking Peter, James, and John with him. He experiences deep emotional anguish, knowing that his crucifixion is imminent. According to the Gospel of Luke, his prayer is so intense that his sweat becomes like drops of blood, a phenomenon known as hematidrosis. This occurs under extreme stress, when the blood vessels in the skin can rupture, mixing blood with sweat. The prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane reveals Jesus' inner struggle and intense psychological suffering. Jesus prays, asking God that, if possible, the cup of suffering he is about to face might pass from him. But at the same time, he submits to God's will, saying,
"Not my will, but yours be done."
This shows Jesus' human side and the internal struggle between the desire to avoid suffering and the acceptance of the divine plan. Despite Jesus' anguish, the disciples fall asleep repeatedly, showing their inability to grasp the gravity of the situation and their lack of vigilance. This emphasizes the feeling of loneliness and abandonment Jesus is facing. Judas Iscariot, one of the 12 disciples who had also witnessed many miracles performed by the Lord, had negotiated with the religious leaders to betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. He knew that Jesus often withdrew to pray and had arranged with the religious leaders to identify him with a kiss, the kiss of betrayal. Judas' betrayal and Jesus' arrest are seen as the fulfillment of prophecies and the beginning of the sacrifice that offers redemption to humanity. Judas arrives at the garden with a crowd armed with Roman soldiers and temple guards, as if Jesus were a dangerous criminal or a fugitive. He approaches Jesus and greets him with a kiss, a prearranged signal to identify Jesus to his captors. This gesture, normally a sign of affection and respect, is used in a cruel and ironic way to hand Jesus over to his enemies. Jesus responds to Judas' kiss with a question.
"Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?"
Jesus doesn't react with anger or violence, but acknowledges the act as part of the divine plan. Judas' betrayal and the subsequent arrest mark the beginning of the process that will lead to the crucifixion. Jesus is then arrested by the Roman soldiers and temple guards. He surrenders peacefully, accepting the arrest as part of his destiny, fully aware that he is the Lamb of God, and for this purpose, Jesus is then taken to the house of the high priest Caiaphas, who, by the way, had been appointed by the Roman government, which was against biblical principles. In the basement of this house was the prison where Jesus arrived in the early hours of the morning. He stayed there until dawn without sleep, being beaten by soldiers who blindfolded him, slapped him across the face, and mocked him, demanding that Jesus prophesy which soldier had struck him. Meanwhile, outside the prison, his disciple Peter denied him 3 times, just as Jesus had predicted before his arrest. Jesus was first tried by the Sanhedrin, the Jewish religious council. This trial took place at night, which was irregular and considered illegal under Jewish law. During the trial, the testimonies against Jesus were contradictory, and there was no consensus on the charges. However, Jesus remained mostly silent throughout the trial. The Jewish religious leaders, especially the Pharisees and Sadducees, saw Jesus as a threat to their power and to their interpretation of religious laws. They accused Jesus of blasphemy for claiming to be the Son of God and, by extension, the promised Messiah. Since they were not allowed to impose a death sentence under Jewish law without Roman approval, the religious leaders took Jesus to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. They accused Jesus of claiming to be the king of the Jews, a charge that suggested he was challenging Roman authority and the established political order. At dawn, Jesus is handed over to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, and the process of trial and crucifixion begins. Pilate conducted an interrogation of Jesus. Initially, Pilate found no fault in Jesus and made several attempts to release him, offering to free him as part of the Passover tradition, which allowed for the release of one prisoner. Pilate also attempted to shift the responsibility to Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee. But Herod sent Jesus back to Pilate without reaching a verdict. It was Roman custom during the Jewish Passover celebration to release a prisoner as a gesture of goodwill to the people. This practice was an opportunity for the governor to gain favor with the public and ease social tensions. So Pilate presented the people with a choice: to release Jesus or Barabbas. Barabbas was a revolutionary, a man who had fought against Roman occupation, and for many Jews, he represented the hope of freedom. The religious leaders, knowing Barabbas' popularity, pushed for his release. They wanted the crowd to choose Barabbas over Jesus, ensuring that the Nazarene would be sentenced to death. The crowd, stirred up by the religious leaders, demanded Jesus' crucifixion. Pilate, pressured by the potential for a riot and the people's dissatisfaction, eventually gave in and pronounced the death sentence. In a symbolic gesture, he washed his hands in front of the crowd, claiming he was not responsible for Jesus' blood, though this did not absolve him from the execution. Jesus was then sentenced to crucifixion, a method of execution reserved for criminals and rebels. The sentence was meant to serve as both a severe punishment and a deterrent, taking advantage of the visual and psychological impact of a public crucifixion. From the moment Pilate decreed the death sentence, the torture began. The scourging was one of the most brutal punishments employed by the Romans, often used to humiliate and torture prisoners before execution. And Jesus was no exception. A detailed description of this suffering, though shocking, helps us grasp the magnitude of the agony he endured. The instrument of torture was the Roman whip, known as the flagellum, which was specifically designed to inflict maximum pain. It consisted of several strips of rawhide intertwined with sharp pieces of bone, metal, and even lead balls. These additions were intended to deeply lacerate the flesh, exposing muscles, tendons, and in extreme cases, even internal organs. The Roman soldiers treated Jesus as though he deserved such punishment and, with brutal force and no mercy, lashed him with the flagellum. Each strike made Jesus shudder in pain, his cries echoing through the air. His skin tore open, leaving deep, gaping wounds. The sheer force of the blows ripped chunks of skin, revealing the muscles and nerves beneath. The pain was unbearable, and his body was soon drenched in blood, a sight witnessed by many. If he hadn't been bound, he would have collapsed into the pool of blood flowing from his body. Along with unbearable pain, Jesus also faced extreme humiliation. The one who had once raised the dead, given sight to the blind, and made the paralyzed walk now stood completely submitted to God's will. Jesus came to die in our place, to bear the guilt of a sin he never committed. For the Bible says, "Without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness." He became a curse for us out of his immeasurable love for humanity. The consequences of the scourging were devastating: hemorrhage, or intense blood loss, leading to hypotension, low blood pressure, shock, and in severe cases, death. The open wounds were prone to infection, which could lead to sepsis, a widespread blood infection. The intense pain, blood loss, and tissue damage caused systemic shock, leading to a drop in blood pressure and organ failure. Jesus' body was left completely mutilated, with shredded skin, exposed muscles, and blood pouring from him. The scourging left him severely weakened, on the verge of death before even being taken for crucifixion. This brutal torture paved the way for even greater suffering, highlighting the cruelty of his tormentors and the depth of his sacrifice. After the scourging, The Roman soldiers took Jesus to a place of mockery, and as part of the humiliation process, they placed a crown of thorns on his head and dressed him in a purple robe, as we'll mention next. They pressed the crown of thorns down hard, driving the thorns deep into Jesus' scalp, and blood began to flow down his face, already weary from the suffering he had endured. The crown of thorns was crafted by the Roman soldiers as an act of mockery and cruelty. They used thorny branches common in the region, weaving them together to form a circle. The long, sharp thorns were chosen to intensify the pain and suffering. The crown of thorns caused immense and constant pain. The thorns pierced the scalp, a part of the body rich in nerve endings, amplifying the sensation of pain. This agony was a significant addition to the suffering already caused by the scourging and physical exhaustion. The thorns could have caused severe injuries. The constant pressure and depth of the thorns may have not only pierced the scalp, but also damaged nerves and penetrated the skull. These injuries could have resulted in heavy bleeding, inflammation, and extreme headaches. Beyond the physical wounds, the crown of thorns could have contributed to infection, as the scalp was exposed to unsanitary conditions, further worsening Jesus' health. The crown of thorns also had a psychological purpose. It was created to mock Jesus, symbolizing a twisted parody of a royal crown. By placing the crown on Jesus' head, the soldiers ridiculed him as the king of the Jews, further intensifying his public humiliation. The crown of thorns, besides the immediate pain it caused, may have worsened the suffering during the crucifixion. The presence of the thorns contributed to the overall physical and emotional torment, making the experience of the crucifixion even more excruciating and degrading. The crown of thorns also holds deep symbolic meaning. It is seen as a representation of the sins and suffering of humanity that Jesus bore. His physical suffering is interpreted as part of the redemptive sacrifice, where he endured pain and humiliation for the salvation of others. The purple robe is specifically mentioned in John 19 verse 2. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe. The choice of purple is loaded with symbolism. In ancient Rome, purple was associated with royalty and wealth due to the high cost of the dyes used to produce it. It was a color that indicated power and status, typically worn by emperors and nobles. Therefore, using this color to mock Jesus accentuates the irony of the moment, the King of Kings being treated as an object of ridicule. The purple robe is not just an aesthetic detail, but a crucial part of the mockery Jesus endured. By dressing Jesus in the purple robe, the Roman soldiers were mocking the idea that he was a king while subjecting him to cruel humiliation. The contrast between the royal color and Jesus' suffering underscores the cruelty of the ridicule. After being sentenced to crucifixion, Jesus was forced to carry his own cross, something that was not always expected of those condemned to death by crucifixion, and he bore his cross to the place of execution. This event is known as the path to Calvary, or the Via Crucis. The cross was made up of two parts, the vertical beam, which remained fixed at the crucifixion site, and the horizontal beam, which Jesus carried on his shoulder, already torn by the lashes he received the previous day, in addition to the physical exhaustion from having not slept the night before. The horizontal beam of the cross, also called the patibulum, weighed between 66 and 110 pounds. Jesus, already exhausted from the scourging, physical suffering, and weakened state of health, had to carry this considerable weight. The journey to Calvary was marked by intense physical exhaustion for Jesus. In addition to the open wounds, the intense pain from the scourging, the crown of thorns, and physical exhaustion from lack of sleep due to the previous night's arrest and mockery by the soldiers, the prolonged walk in such a weakened condition made the task extremely difficult and painful. Then began the Via Dolorosa, or the Way of Suffering, a path through a bustling marketplace where many people passed by. This was precisely what Pontius Pilate intended. He wanted as many people as possible to witness Jesus' suffering, humiliating him before the Jews and the others gathered there. The path stretched nearly a kilometer, and despite being wounded and exhausted, Jesus walked it barefoot over gravel, his feet worn from the torment of standing the entire previous night without rest. He couldn't stop because Roman soldiers dragged him forward, indifferent to his agony and exhaustion. Jesus' struggle to carry the cross became so severe that the Roman soldiers compelled Simon of Cyrene, a man passing through the city, to help him carry it the rest of the way to the crucifixion site. Simon was a Jew from Cyrene, in modern-day Libya, who was forced into this act by the soldiers. As Jesus trudged along, he was subjected to ridicule and mockery from the crowd and the soldiers. Many onlookers expressed scorn and derision, while Jesus continued to suffer under the weight of the cross and the pain inflicted by his tormentors. Along the way, Jesus encountered a group of women from Jerusalem who wept and lamented for him. Even amidst his overwhelming suffering, he found the strength to respond, telling them not to cry for him, but for themselves and their children. This was a reference to the future suffering and trials that Jerusalem would face. The journey culminated at the site of the crucifixion, known as Calvary or Golgotha, meaning place of the skull. Located outside the walls of Jerusalem, this area was deliberately chosen for its visibility to passers-by, amplifying the public shame and the deterrent effect of the execution. The physical and emotional toll of this journey added to the immense suffering Jesus was already enduring, making the crucifixion even more agonizing. The walk to Calvary is seen as a crucial part of the process of redemption, symbolizing Jesus' voluntary sacrifice for humanity. After the grueling trek, Jesus finally reached Calvary, a hill or elevated spot outside Jerusalem's walls, chosen so that the crucifixion could be visible to all as a public warning against crimes and rebellion. Once at the site, preparations for the crucifixion began. The vertical beam of the cross was already fixed in the ground, while the horizontal beam, the patibulum, awaited Jesus. First, the purple robe they had placed on him, which had adhered to his open wounds, was violently torn off. The pain was excruciating, akin to the wounds being reopened, some of which were now on the verge of infection, having received no treatment. In full view of the onlookers, Jesus was then laid on the ground, and the actual crucifixion process commenced, with large iron nails driven into his hands and feet. The nails, typically 6 to 8 inches long, were hammered through Jesus' wrists, between the carpal bones and the radius. The pain was excruciating, a combination of sharp, localized pain and the radiating agony caused by the damage to the nerves. The nails were then driven into his feet, likely one foot over the other. The positioning of the feet caused intense pain and made breathing difficult, while also severely straining his legs. The sheer brutality of this process caused unimaginable pain and immobilized him. After Jesus was nailed to the cross, it was raised and dropped into a hole prepared in the ground. The act of lifting the cross only intensified the pain, as gravity took hold and Jesus' weight pulled against the nails in his hands and feet. To breathe, he had to push himself up on his feet and pull with his arms, creating even more agony, especially as the nails pressed against the sensitive median nerves in his wrists. His body now hung fully exposed on the cross. The position of Jesus' body on the cross made it excruciating to breathe. With his body stretched and suspended, every breath became a struggle, causing severe pain in his arms, legs, and chest, as well as cramping. The stretching of his body created intense pressure on his nerves and muscles, resulting in searing pain that would radiate throughout his limbs and torso. The significant blood loss from the flagellation and the wounds caused by the nails likely led Jesus into hypovolemic shock, a condition where the body can no longer circulate enough blood to maintain blood pressure and organ function. The suspended position forced Jesus to bear the full weight of his body, which compressed his diaphragm and made breathing increasingly difficult. Each breath required him to push up with his legs and pull with his arms, a movement that caused excruciating pain and exhaustion. The harsh sun and lack of water worsened his condition, leading to severe dehydration. This would have caused his blood pressure to drop further and likely resulted in kidney failure. The constant effort to breathe and bear the weight of his own body created extreme muscle fatigue and total exhaustion. Internal injuries could also have occurred, as the pressure of the nails and the trauma of the crucifixion worsened over time. As the nails possibly damaged major blood vessels, there could have been additional bleeding and more severe complications. The crucifixion also likely led to cyanosis, a bluish discoloration of the skin caused by a lack of oxygen, as Jesus struggled to maintain his respiratory and cardiovascular functions. Amidst this overwhelming suffering, his pain, exhaustion, difficulty breathing, and the burning sun, Jesus cried out from the cross,
"I am thirsty."
The crucifixion was a brutal method of execution, causing intense pain and dehydration. His words reflected the very real, physical torment he was enduring. And after hours on the cross, his body was likely in a state of severe dehydration and total exhaustion. After Jesus' request, the soldiers offered him a cup of vinegar or sour wine, a low-quality drink mixed with water. This was in line with the Roman practice of providing condemned individuals with vinegar mixed with water to slightly ease their thirst, while also prolonging their suffering. Jesus refused the drink before his death, choosing to fully complete the mission he had been sent to fulfill. The statement, "I am thirsty," demonstrates the true humanity of Jesus. Though divine, he experienced the full range of human conditions, including hunger, thirst, and pain. Jesus became fully human to redeem humanity. At the end of his earthly life, he had given everything in terms of physical and spiritual suffering. His ability to speak diminished due to exhaustion and difficulty breathing. Jesus made his final statements in a state of extreme agony. While on the cross, enduring intense suffering, he spoke several phrases recorded in the Gospels. Among them were, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing," Luke 23 verse 34, "I am thirsty," John 19 verse 28, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Matthew 27 verse 46, Mark 15 verse 34, "It is finished," John 19 verse 30, and "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit," Luke 23 verse 46. This final statement was made after Jesus had spent hours on the cross, having completed his mission. These words reflect his suffering, the fulfillment of his mission, and his forgiveness of those mocking him, challenging him to come down from the cross if he were truly the Son of God. An inscription was placed above Jesus' head on the cross, written in 3 languages, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. The inscription read, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews," in Latin, "Jesus Nazarenus Rex Iudiorum." This was meant to indicate the reason for his execution and mock his claim to kingship, although Jesus never made such a claim. He had left his kingdom in heaven to die in our place. After approximately 6 hours on the cross, Jesus died. Crucifixion resulted in a slow death, typically from asphyxiation, blood loss, and shock. After his death, a Roman soldier pierced his side with a spear to confirm that he was truly dead. Jesus, unjustly condemned, was subjected to one of the most brutal methods of execution ever devised, crucifixion. It was not simply a form of punishment, but the cruelest way the Roman Empire used to humiliate and torture the condemned. The person crucified suffered agony that went beyond physical pain. They were publicly humiliated, and Jesus was no exception. Each nail driven into his wrists and feet was a declaration of his mission and sacrifice. The psychological and spiritual suffering, including the sense of abandonment and the weight of carrying humanity's sins, likely contributed to Jesus' total agony. Jesus' crucifixion is central to the Christian faith, symbolizing the ultimate sacrifice and the redemption offered through his death. It is remembered as an act of love and mercy from God, for we have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Jesus' greatest pain was not the cross, the betrayal, or the humiliation, but the feeling of the weight of sin, which caused him to cry out, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" God turned away at that moment because Jesus was bearing sins he hadn't committed, but that humanity had, the righteous for the unrighteous. He became cursed for us, as it is written, "Cursed is everyone who is hung on a tree." The bodies of those crucified were often left on the cross, where birds would come to feed on them. In many cases, the birds would begin feeding while the crucified person was still alive, adding to their suffering. However, the Bible does not record this happening to Jesus. With Jesus' death confirmed, his body needed to be taken down from the cross. According to the Gospels, Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Sanhedrin and a secret disciple of Jesus, requested permission from Pontius Pilate to remove the body. Pilate granted the request, and Joseph, along with Nicodemus, another member of the Sanhedrin who had also become a follower of Jesus, took care of the body. Jesus' body was carefully taken down from the cross. In accordance with Jewish tradition, the burial had to be done quickly, especially before the Sabbath, which began at sunset. Joseph and Nicodemus prepared the body for burial, wrapping it in linen cloths and applying aromatic spices like myrrh and aloes to honor the body and slow the process of decay. Jesus was placed in a new tomb, which had been carved into the rock and belonged to Joseph of Arimathea. The tomb was located in a garden near the site of the crucifixion, which allowed for a quick transfer of the body. The use of a new tomb was a sign of respect and honored Jesus' dignity, as new tombs were typically reserved for important individuals or significant ceremonies. After placing the body in the tomb, a large stone was rolled over the entrance to seal it. This stone was heavy and designed to protect the tomb from intruders or desecration. The tomb was sealed to ensure security, and as the chief priest said, so his disciples wouldn't steal his body and claim that Jesus had risen. But the story doesn't end there. On the third day, the stone sealing the tomb was rolled away. Jesus had risen. Death, which seemed to be the end, was defeated. He appeared to his disciples, proving that eternal life is real and that God's love knows no bounds. Jesus is alive in heaven and lives forever, ready to help all those who recognize him as God. The crucifixion of Jesus was not just a historical event. It was the greatest act of love humanity has ever received. In his infinite mercy, God gave his only Son to save us all. Every pain, every tear, every drop of bloodshed was out of love. And through his death and resurrection, Jesus opened the way to redemption. He showed us that despite our mistakes, we are worthy of forgiveness, worthy of a love that transcends time, pain, and death. That is why he is the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through him. This sacrifice is the greatest gift humanity could ever receive. And today, as we remember his crucifixion, we also celebrate the hope that was reborn with him. Life triumphed over death, and love conquered sin. What could you do in response to this boundless love? Giving your life to Jesus would be a great start. So, what are you waiting for? Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Seek Jesus and stay with him.